common objection to the Gospels is that many people think they were written decades after the lifetime of Jesus and are therefore not reliable.
My view is a fairly standard view, which is that the stories were in circulation for many years before the gospel writers produced their accounts. Jesus and his disciples, of course, were Aramaic speakers in Galilee, a rural part of Galilee, and the Gospels are written in Greek. And so these are accounts that were originally passed around probably in the native language of Palestine, but then are later written some decades later by Greek-speaking Christians.
Bart Ehrman also says in his book called How Jesus Became God, the very first surviving account of Jesus' life was written 35 to 40 years after his death. Our last canonical gospel was written 60 to 65 years after his death. That's obviously a lot of time. Bart Ehrman is basically insinuating that the Gospels were written decades after Jesus and therefore are not as reliable. I've gone over gospel reliability in a multitude of other videos, linked in the description below. Today, I simply want to demonstrate the double standard many scholars and laymen fail to apply to other ancient texts besides the Bible, which, as we will see, were written sometimes centuries after the event itself. Alexander the Great is considered to be one of, if not the best, military general to exist. Alexander was born around 356 BC. He became king of Macedonia in 336 BC, and then from then on conquered all of the Persian Empire and continued even all the way to modern day India. While in Babylon, Alexander became sick and eventually died in 323 BC. Based on this, Alexander is clearly a great figure in history. But what are the earliest accounts of Alexander from the various historians in antiquity? Well, the first historian we have who documents Alexander's life is that of Diodorus from 60 to 30 BC. His writings on Alexander are considered to be reliable according to historians, yet his writings come around 278 years after Alexander's existence. Now, if we apply Bart Ehrman's standard to the situation, we are in trouble with the historical life of Alexander. We should be putting heavy doubt on the accuracy of Diodorus, as his writings come centuries after the lifetime of Alexander. Yet, what you'll find is that most modern historians of antiquity don't doubt his writings on Alexander. Many, in fact, praise him for his historical method and his uses of sources. Keep in mind, according to Bar Ehrman, the first accounts of Jesus come roughly 35 to 40 years after his death. Yet scholars like Bar Ehrman still seem to put heavy doubt on the Gospels, which is illogical if we're assuming time affects the historical reliability of a document. This is very clearly the double standard Bar Ehrman fails to apply to other texts of history, as if we are in doubt with the Gospels, which were written decades after Jesus, we should almost reject anything about Alexander when it comes centuries after his existence. There's one more historian that we'll cover, which is a much more similar situation we have with the dating of the Gospels. This is that of Tacitus, who is considered to be one of the greatest ancient historians, as he documents much of early Roman history in his books titled The Annals. In general, Tacitus records Roman history from the time of Tiberius in AD 14 all the way to around AD 68, with the end of Emperor Nero's reign. Now, as a historian, Tacitus is recording history from before his time when he speaks about Emperor Tiberius, as Tacitus himself was born in AD 56. Not to mention that Tacitus finishes his book of the Annals in 109 AD. Tacitus is recording history decades, if not close to a century after his own time. But we don't see many modern historians freaking out about this issue. Why? Because this was common for ancient Greco Roman histories. In fact, Tacitus actually records his history of Rome very early on compared to many other ancient historians, such as Diodorus, whom we covered wrote his history of Alexander almost 3 centuries after his existence. Yet again, if we were to apply Bar Ehrman's standard of history, we should be reluctant to trust Tacitus, or at least the accounts Tacitus gives regarding Tiberius Caesar or even the fires of Rome, as Tacitus, in some cases, wrote decades more than the dating of the Gospels from Jesus' lifetime. In Bar Ehrman's book titled Did Jesus Exist?, Ehrman uses Tacitus' account of Jesus and the persecution of the Christians in Rome to justify Jesus existing as a historical figure. What's interesting is that even though Tacitus is writing decades after the fires of Rome and recording what took place, Bartman seems to use Tacitus as a historical source and almost takes for granted that Tacitus is reliable in relating the persecution of the Christians. Now, I agree with Bart. Tacitus is very reliable on Roman history, especially when speaking about the persecution of Christians. But scholars like him and many others don't apply this same standard to the New Testament. Simply, what many scholars fail to do is to keep a consistent historical method. Skeptical New Testament scholars throw such a high standard on the Gospel accounts for being written a couple decades after what is recording. Yet when they read another ancient historical account, they seem to take for granted what is written, even if it's written decades or even centuries after the fact. Thank you for watching, and God bless.